April 1945, Berlin was burning. The Third Reich, once a machine of terrifying precision, now groaned under its own weight, collapsing into rubble beneath the fire of Allied bombers and the relentless advance of Soviet tanks. In the streets, children carried rifles, officers deserted in disguise. The cities were graveyards, the countryside full of smoke and silence. Hitler was sealed in his bunker. Entire divisions vanished into forests, and the air smelled of gasoline and desperation. Amid this chaos, one name appeared briefly in a flurry of orders before vanishing forever: Kapitän Lieutenant Wilhelm Krieger. Naval intelligence, decorated twice for encryption breakthroughs and clandestine routing of U-boat logistics. His record was clean, but his name whispered with weight. There were rumors that Krieger had been attached to Reichssicherheitsdienst, Hitler's shadow intelligence. Others believed he had worked on something called Operation Nixie, a rumored fallback plan involving encrypted escape routes, intelligence dumps, and something darker. In his last confirmed sighting, Krieger was seen in Hamburg on April 17th, boarding a military convoy headed toward the southern ports. It was chaos. German civilians were fleeing en masse. The British were bombing rail lines daily. What was left of the Kriegsmarine was evacuating high-value personnel under forged papers and coded manifestos. But Krieger didn't make it to the coast. His name disappears from all records after that day. No death certificate, no prisoner file, no confirmed sightings, just absence. One man stepping into history's final firestorm and not stepping back out. The Allies assumed he died in the bombings. The Soviets believed he had defected. But within the fractured intelligence community of post-war Europe, the name Wilhelm Krieger would not fade. It would haunt briefings and barroom whispers, not because of who he was, but because of what he might have taken with him when he vanished. At first, no one noticed he was missing. Too many names were being lost by the hour. Files burned, cities leveled, orders shredded or forged. The Third Reich had entered its death spiral, and Wilhelm Krieger had slipped into its smoke. When the war ended, Allied war crimes units searched for key Nazi officials, SS officers, camp doctors, financial chiefs. But Krieger wasn't on any most wanted list. He was too obscure, too clean. Just another uniform lost in the flood. It wasn't until 1946, when intercepted Soviet cables mentioned a naval code specialist presumed to have escaped west with stolen intelligence, that British MI6 reopened the case. They scoured POW camps, checked death registries. Nothing. No burial, no capture, no repatriation. His personnel file, half-burnt and waterlogged, offered no clues. Even his family in Bremen claimed they hadn't heard from him since early '45. In a letter to a cousin dated April 3rd, Krieger wrote only 7 words: "If I survive, it won't be here." Then, nothing. The file grew cold. By 1950, West German authorities declared him legally dead. But the world outside the files told a different story. Locals in northern Bavaria told of a lone officer seen in the woods weeks after surrender, speaking accented French and hiding from military patrols. In Spain, a former Luftwaffe pilot swore Krieger had boarded a cargo vessel bound for Argentina. In Marseille, a woman claimed to have seen him praying in a monastery under a different name. Each rumor twisted the story tighter. Who was chasing Krieger, and why? Was he hiding from Allied justice, or from something inside the Reich itself? The more intelligence services searched, the more impossible the story became. A man without a grave, a ghost in post-war Europe. His name became a myth told in hushed voices. Some believed he'd fled to South America with a satchel of stolen documents and a new identity. Others were convinced he'd gone underground, literally. But one thing was certain: Wilhelm Krieger hadn't just vanished. He had erased himself, or someone had done it for him. The war ended, but the silence never fully returned to the hills of Lower Saxony. Through the Cold War years and long after the Berlin Wall fell, strange stories drifted from the countryside, quiet tales that never made the papers. Locals spoke of ghosts in the woods, strange lights beneath the trees, whispers near old stone. Children dared one another to walk near the ruins on moonless nights, where they claimed the earth sometimes vibrated beneath your feet, where old dogs refused to enter. It was an unspoken truth in the villages below the Harz Mountains. Something was hidden beneath the ruins of Falkenstein. There were no formal investigations, no military reports, just the slow accretion of rumor. In the 1,970 seconds, a hunter claimed he found a section of ground near the castle that sounded hollow when struck. He returned the next day and found it filled in. In 1989, a pair of hikers exploring the eastern slope of the hill reported seeing a metal hatch buried in rock with a rusted chain still bolted into the stone, but when they returned, the entrance was gone. Others spoke of man-made walls exposed after heavy rains, then buried again by time. It never became more than folklore, just another story shared in pubs after the third beer. But for a handful of old men, retired soldiers, local historians, amateur cryptologists, the whispers took root. Some believed the ruins had been used during the war. Others suspected something older, deeper, a remnant from a darker time. And one name occasionally floated to the surface like a fragment of a forgotten tune: Krieger. No context, no explanation. Just a name, and the vague suggestion that someone once disappeared near this place and never came out again. It wasn't much to go on, but it was enough to keep the story alive, buried beneath decades of moss and silence. Falkenstein Castle was built in the 13th century, a gray stone spine jutting from the Harz Mountains. For centuries it had loomed above the forest, changing hands through wars, empires, and dynasties. By 1945, it had become little more than a historical footnote until a single Allied bombing run clipped its west wing, collapsing much of the inner structure into itself. After that, the ruins were left to rot. Time did what bombs had started. Ivy overtook the battlements, the cellars flooded and froze. The eastern tower became a nest for bats. Tourists stopped visiting. The land around it was designated protected woodland in the 1,990 seconds. But no one seriously considered restoring it. That changed in 2024, when a small archaeological team from the University of Göttingen secured a grant to stabilize the structure. The project was modest: clean up the site, preserve what was left, open a visitor trail. But from the first day, something felt off. The ground didn't behave like it should have. Subsurface scans returned odd voids, shapes inconsistent with natural cave systems. The lead geotech dismissed them as old cellars or mine shafts. A few students joked about hidden bunkers and Nazi gold. The forest was thick with those kinds of stories. But as the team began clearing debris from the main hall, they uncovered an unusually smooth stone wall different from the surrounding medieval construction. Behind it, a sealed arch, cemented with wartime mortar, not on any of the original blueprints. The find should have been thrilling. Instead, it felt like a warning. The project lead logged it, scheduled a structural review, and taped it off for safety. But one doctoral student, working late and curious beyond reason, ignored the order. He pulled back a loose stone. Cold air rushed out, thick with dust and age. Behind the wall, something waited, something that hadn't seen the light in 80 years. By midsummer 2025, the restoration at Falkenstein was ahead of schedule. Teams had stabilized the south wall, mapped half the castle's collapsed interior, and even uncovered a forgotten section of wine cellar buried under centuries of debris. It was there, on a humid July afternoon, that everything changed. While clearing the lower chamber, two workers noticed something strange. A section of the cellar wall that sounded hollow when tapped, the mortar newer than the surrounding medieval stone. At first, it looked like a crude repair. But the more they chipped away, the more deliberate it seemed, too precise, too clean. Behind the wall, hidden under layers of dust and fractured brick, they found a sealed stone archway. It was recessed into the earth, shaped in the Romanesque style, but reinforced with iron and lined with concrete dating to the early 1942. Wartime materials. The excitement was immediate. Cameras were brought in. The university's project lead filed for official excavation clearance. This could be the discovery that redefined the site, evidence of wartime use, maybe even a hidden escape route. The wall was removed carefully, brick by brick. What lay beyond wasn't part of any castle blueprint. A narrow tunnel stretched downward at a steep angle, just wide enough for a man to crawl. The air was stale, dry, heavy with the scent of rust and old stone. The first few meters were natural rock, but deeper in, the walls became smooth concrete, reinforced with rebar, a structure built to last, not merely to hide. And then they reached the door. A thick steel hatch, sealed from the inside. No lock, no latch, just welded edges and a rusted hinge scorched black with age. Whoever was inside had never intended to leave. The workers hesitated. The air felt wrong. It wasn't just the chill or the silence, it was the feeling that something had been buried here for a reason. Still, they forced the hatch open. It groaned like something wounded. Lights flickered on, dust swirling like smoke in the beam, and then they saw it. A small, windowless room, a cot, a desk, stacks of crates, a rusted typewriter frozen mid-sentence, and on the floor, curled near the wall bones in a faded uniform, as if death had come quietly in the dark. The man inside had sealed himself away, and he had waited. The air inside the bunker was still, untouched by time. The walls were lined with peeling maps, their ink faded to ghosts. A military cot, sunken with age, sat beside a steel desk rusted to its core. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its filament broken decades ago. But it was the body that held the room captive. Curled against the far wall, knees drawn to chest, bones wrapped in the remnants of a naval uniform. The wool had rotted in places, but enough remained to show the insignia, Capitan Lieutenant. A leather satchel rested beneath one arm, and around the neck, half buried in dust, were rusted ID tags. The name stamped into the metal was unmistakable: Wilhelm Krieger. Archaeologists halted all work. The authorities were called in. Forensic teams in hazmat suits documented every detail. The remains were exhumed and taken to Göttingen for analysis. The satchel was sealed and transported separately. Inside, notes in faded Sutherland script, a field journal, and 2 rolls of undeveloped film. But it was the body that confirmed the impossible. Dental records from the Kriegsmarine archives, long digitized, matched exactly. The skeleton's age, bone density, and recovered DNA all aligned with a man in his early 32s, Wilhelm Krieger's age, in 1945. It was him, there was no doubt. The man who had vanished at the end of the war, who had left no trace, no grave, no answers, had died here, alone, beneath Falkenstein Castle. He had sealed himself inside this hidden bunker, deep beneath centuries of ruin, and never emerged. The journals, partially legible, hinted at fear not of Allied capture, but of something internal. Phrases like, "They know I have it," and "This place is the only safe ground left," repeated throughout. He wrote of betrayal, silence, and watching the forest above for movement that never came. Krieger hadn't fled abroad. He hadn't escaped justice or built a new life in Argentina. He had gone to ground, literally. And he had died beneath the very country he once served, in a room no one was ever supposed to find. What haunted him in those final weeks remains a mystery. But Falkenstein, it seemed, had kept his secret for 80 years. Until now. The room was preserved like a tomb sealed with intention. No mold, no signs of animal life, just stillness, clinical, unsettling. every object was where Krieger had left it, ration tins stacked in rows. A pile of worn blankets folded with military precision. Books in both German and French, their pages yellowed but intact. A copy of Goethe's Faust lay beside a rusted oil lamp. Near the cot, a field radio receiver, an E-52 Köln model, standard issue for high-level intelligence officers. Its wiring had been carefully dismantled, suggesting Krieger either didn't want to be found or didn't want to be listened to. But the centerpiece was the journals. 3 notebooks, bound in cracking leather, written in a hand that became shakier as the pages turned. The first was methodical: food inventory, dates, sketches of the tunnels. The second spiraled. Paragraphs turned frantic. Sentences looped and crossed over themselves. Names were redacted, blotted out. Certain words appeared over and over. Betrayal, contingency, both sides. Krieger hadn't just been hiding from the Allies, he feared his own command. One entry, dated April 21st, read, "If they find me, it won't be a trial, it will be a disposal. The Reich eats its own now." Another, "They told me to destroy the files. I didn't. That was my crime." There were days where the writing stopped for weeks at a time. Then pages would return, frantic, as if written under candlelight at 3 a.m., nerves raw and shaking. He documented distant gunfire, aircraft overhead, the eventual silence of post-war Germany. One entry in particular haunted the team. "The world above has changed. I heard church bells today. They do not bomb cities with bells." It was clear he survived for some time, weeks, possibly months. But isolation, hunger, and fear had reduced the once decorated officer to a man afraid of his own footsteps. This wasn't a coward's hideout, it was a cell built by paranoia and secrets too dangerous to share. Krieger didn't die of exposure or combat. He died from something colder: abandonment, betrayal, and the crushing certainty that no one was coming to save him, not friend, not enemy. And whatever he had refused to destroy stayed buried with him. Until now. At first, the notebooks read like the ramblings of a man unraveling under pressure. But deeper in, patterns began to emerge. Carefully coded phrases, mirrored page numbers, ciphered coordinates, layers of encryption buried beneath apparent madness. Krieger had left breadcrumbs, not just diary entries. The phrase, Operation Nixie, appeared for the first time on page 47 of the third notebook, underlined in red ink. No historical record confirms the existence of such an operation. Yet Krieger treated it as a known quantity, referencing it repeatedly in context with naval routes, false manifests, and microfilm caches. One section outlined Tier I collaborators, names written in shorthand, matched with ports and safe houses from Hamburg to Marseille. Another page showed a crude map of the North Sea, marked with shipping lanes, and something called ghost corridors. Several of the notations matched real smuggling routes later used by Nazi fugitives during the Ratline's exodus. But what Krieger carried wasn't escape logistics, it was leverage. One heavily guarded entry, labeled Nixie Final Phase, made mention of a package, film secured, encoded, stored beneath the altar. "Only I know the markers. If retrieved, they will kill for it any side." There was a line scratched hastily in the margin. "The transfer is real." Nothing more. No explanation. But that single phrase changed everything. Intelligence historians would later debate its meaning. Some believed it referred to documents stolen from Allied archives, others to a list of double agents embedded across Europe. But some whispered darker theories: biological experimentation, uranium transfers, or even early post-war technology prototypes smuggled out before Germany's surrender. Whatever the truth, Krieger had it. And he knew it was enough to make him a target. The journals suggest he had no intention of remaining loyal to the Reich in its death throes. He had planned to defect, but the destination is never named. No government, no contact, just vague references to the receiver and instructions in the event of breach. Whoever Krieger was trying to reach, he never made it. Or perhaps he chose the silence of the bunker over the price of what he knew. 80 years later, that silence has been broken, and the contents of those notebooks have begun to whisper again. In the weeks following the discovery, Krieger's name surged through intelligence circles like a long-dormant virus. Academics, journalists, and former operatives, some now well into their 80s, were pulled from retirement to consult. And as the evidence mounted, so did the question: who, exactly, had Krieger been running from? Some pointed to the Odessa network, the rumored post-war escape system built to funnel Nazi officers out of Europe. If Krieger held information that could compromise those routes or expose high-ranking fugitives, he may have been silenced before he could trade it. Others believed his ties to German naval intelligence placed him squarely between two powers with very different goals. To the Soviets, he would have been a prized asset, especially if Operation Nixie involved technology or collaborators embedded in the East. To the Americans and British, he may have been a threat. A man with too many secrets, too many names, and no allegiance left. One declassified CIA memo from 1952 referenced an asset lost in Sector Falkenstein, but didn't name Krieger directly. Historians now believe the file may have been tied to an aborted extraction attempt in late 45. The memo included a chilling note: subject terminated or self-contained. Do not engage. Former Stasi officials, interviewed decades later, recalled hearing stories of a German naval officer who refused asylum in the Soviet zone and vanished during the evacuation. One remembered the name Krieger. Another didn't, but remembered a man who knew where the names were buried. Theories began to spiral. Had Krieger attempted to sell intelligence to the Allies and been betrayed? Was he meant to be extracted and then abandoned once deemed too dangerous? Or had someone within the Reich ordered him silenced to protect something larger, something still undiscovered? A note scrawled in one of his final entries read, "I was never part of the machine, only the maintenance crew. They built monsters. I just fed them paper." It's a line that offers no answers, only more smoke. But one thing is clear: Krieger wasn't hiding from defeat. He was hiding from the aftermath. From those who wanted the past erased, from both sides of a new war already being written in secret ink. And in that war, he was the last witness. The mystery wasn't just that Wilhelm Krieger had vanished, it was how thoroughly the earth itself had swallowed him. The bunker beneath Falkenstein hadn't merely been hidden, it had been sealed by fate. On the 22nd of April 1945, days after Krieger was last seen in Hamburg, Allied bombers targeting munitions convoys overshot their mark. One stray payload struck the western flank of Falkenstein Castle, collapsing the upper cellars and triggering a chain reaction of debris that buried the wine cellar and the entrance to Krieger's tunnel. A local report filed in 1946 noted the partial collapse, but restoration was deemed non-essential. The war had ended. The ruins were left to rot. Over the years, shifting soil and encroaching forest made what little remained of the access path completely disappear. Without seismic scanning or excavation, the bunker would have remained entombed forever. But inside, time did not pass in the same way. Journal entries recovered from Krieger's notebooks challenged the assumption that he died quickly. The first entries are dated from April and May 1,945 days after his disappearance. But the handwriting grows thinner, slower, and the content more disjointed, stretching well into November 1946. He wrote of frost on the walls, of sleeping in shifts, of counting the rations down to the last can. One passage in early 46 references bells in the valley, again, and children singing above. It suggests he remained alive for months, maybe over a year. How he survived that long is unclear. The supplies found in the bunker were considerable but not limitless. There was no evidence of a secondary exit, no ventilation system beyond a collapsed grate. He may have hoped someone would find him. Or perhaps he was waiting for the extraction that never came. One final entry, shaky, barely legible, was dated the 2nd of December 1946. It reads only, "No more days. That was the end." Silence resumed. And for nearly 80 years, no one knew. Not the locals who hiked the trails, not the archaeologists who mapped the foundations, not the intelligence agencies who once scoured Europe for missing names. The man they were all looking for had been 20 feet below their boots the entire time alone, sealed in stone, scribbling out his final thoughts in the dark. By autumn 2025, Wilhelm Krieger had become a household name. Headlines called him the Ghost Officer or Germany's Buried Secret. News vans lined the forest roads. Documentary crews filmed reenactments beneath cranes and scaffolding. Podcasters speculated endlessly, was he a whistleblower, a failed spy, or just another man crushed by history? The bunker beneath Falkenstein, once forgotten rubble, became the epicenter of a national reckoning. Historians debated his motives. Military scholars parsed his journals like scripture. Was Krieger a loyal servant of the Reich who lost his nerve when the tide turned? Or had he been something rarer, a man who saw the darkness from the inside and refused to be part of its legacy? His writings offered no easy answers. For every confession, there was ambiguity. For every fact, a contradiction. He called the Reich a machine with no brakes, yet described himself as part of its scaffolding. He wrote of planning to defect, but never to whom. He claimed to possess documents capable of unmaking reputations in 3 nations, but the full contents of the satchel found with him have never been released. That detail alone fanned the flames of conspiracy. Days after the discovery, federal officials arrived and sealed portions of the site. The university's press access was revoked. Several key artifacts, including the satchel and the undeveloped film rolls, were quietly classified under national security statutes. The move drew protests from transparency advocates and fueled speculation across every dark corner of the internet. Was Krieger carrying proof of Allied deals with ex-Nazis, evidence of war crimes buried by both sides? Or something even older, something the war had merely obscured? No one could say. And maybe that was the point. Krieger had died in silence, but in doing so, he left behind a vacuum, one that pulled in truth, lies, and the endless gray space in between. A loyal officer? A defector? A victim? Or something far more complicated, a man who chose to be buried alive rather than be used one more time by a world at war. His legacy wasn't carved in medals or headlines. It was etched into stone, sealed behind a hatch, and left for the world to find only when it was ready to ask the right questions, or accept that some stories aren't meant to be solved, only witnessed. In the end, the story of Wilhelm Krieger isn't about war. It's about what war leaves behind. Not just the bodies, but the questions, the buried truths, the unmarked paths we were never supposed to find. His bunker, now cordoned off and preserved under thick glass and reinforced steel, sits like a scar beneath Falkenstein Castle. Tour groups walk carefully around the perimeter. Audio guides recount his name, his rank, his disappearance. But no one can really explain him, and perhaps no one should. Krieger wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was something more uncomfortable, someone trapped between collapsing ideologies, holding on to knowledge that made him valuable and disposable in the same breath. He didn't flee to freedom. He didn't defect. He descended into the earth, into silence, into a purgatory of his own making. The journals tell the story of a man who didn't trust anyone, not even himself. Of someone who knew that once the war ended, the reckoning would begin, and those holding the wrong secrets wouldn't be spared by peace. His story became a mirror held up to a world still grappling with its past. What are we willing to forget to move forward? Who gets remembered, and who gets buried in sealed rooms beneath castles no one visits anymore? Falkenstein stands again now, its battlements stabilized, its hallways safe. But beneath it remains a separate world, untouched by time. A cot, a rusted typewriter, a room where the war never ended. That sealed hatch is now a memorial, not to Krieger, but to what we'll never truly know. The final shot is not of bones or blueprints. It's the cold metal door closed again, silent, waiting. A monument not to the past, but to how far someone will go to disappear into it. In the end, the world above moved on. But he remained beneath the ashes, surrounded by the ghosts of choices no one ever wanted to make. And now that we've opened his tomb, the question is not what we found, it's what we're willing to do with it. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.